And so our plans this evening, to begin with, we'll just talk a little bit about growing houseplants, some general things, some things that are useful to us, especially if we're beginning. Then we're going to focus on the tough 10 plants to begin with. So these are plants that are absolutely great for beginners to start with. They're familiar to a lot of us if we've been growing plants for a while, so it's nothing too exotic. In fact, a lot of them are old standbys, and they're standbys because they're such solid choices for growing. And then after that, Michaela will actually be presenting to us on succulents. We know there's a lot of interest in succulents in the past several years. They're fun plants, and Michaela's going to tell us all about them. And then lastly, like I mentioned, we will allow questions for both presentations. So certainly stick around to the end if you can, and we'll be more than happy to answer those questions. So house plants are cool again, and that's something you may or may not be aware of. So the past several years, houseplants have been trending, especially with younger audiences. So those under 30, houseplants are something that allows them to experience gardening when they might be in an apartment or in other limited space or maybe limited time because of job responsibilities or even school. And so if we look at some of the trends, the top 7 plants you see there from 2019, a lot of those really are not plants that we're talking about flowering. Those are primarily foliage plants. So that in fact is the #1 selection criteria for most people when growing houseplants. And that makes a lot of sense. African violets are lovely flowers, but when they're not in flower, they're kind of humdrum. There's not a lot going on with the foliage. So certainly we're going to focus a lot this evening on plants that have the impact of the foliage. So no matter whether they're flowering or not, you have a nice show, something to enjoy. The second trend that they really focus on and they really desire is something that's both bug-free and unique. And I think what we'll find as we go through this evening, a lot of these may be old standbys, but there can be cultivars, and that's just short for cultivated varieties. And they may be different, slightly different kinds of the same plant. So there is often different varieties that give us the same ease of growth that we may find with some of the old standbys. And one thing that you may be familiar with, especially if you're on Instagram or some of the other social media channels quite a bit, is Monstera. It's an extremely popular plant right now. They have a lot of different focus on that, including things like Monstera Mondays, which is a thing, believe it or not. So who knew that houseplants were going to be trending on social media, but they are. So definitely, I think this is timely for a lot of people to have an opportunity to learn more. We like houseplants because it actually helps support the quality of life that we enjoy. So houseplants can increase the humidity when we have dry air in a house because they are releasing water through transpiration. So especially when we're talking about air conditionings and things like that, that actually dries out the air, they actually help to increase the humidity. They also at the same time can remove CO2, which they of course use for photosynthesis, as well as different volatile organic chemicals or VOCs or particulates or chemicals such as benzene or even formaldehyde. And all those are sort of chemicals that can come out or volatilize out of different products such as plastics and carpets and paints and things of that nature. It's part of the human environment now, but these plants can actually help capture and sequester that so we're not exposed to it to the same extent. And additionally, there certainly is the research that clearly demonstrates humans have a physiological and a psychological connection with plants. So certainly when we have plants growing in our environment, when we're exposed to them, when we care and tend for them, there are actually psychological benefits for us as individuals. So certainly plants are good to have. So generally when most people start thinking about plants, one of the first places they begin at is the soil or where you're planting it. Well, we're actually not talking about true soils tonight. I wanted to make that point. We're talking about potting medias. And so those medias are going to be created, whether we create our own mix or we purchase one ready-made, but they're not soils. And they do a great job. They do the same things. This is kind of the classic textbook example of a soil. 45% of it are solids, and those are the mineral components, which are sand, silt, and clay. 5% is organic matter, and that's residues from crops and things of that nature. And then 50% of it is pore space. That would be, again, in the idealized soil, a split evenly between air and water. And while we don't have those mineral components in these soils typically, or at least not in their more natural forms, we still have those same sort of categories and organization, and we'll talk about those a little bit. When we're talking about the potting media, it's going to be doing the same things that soil does for a plant. One, it's the anchoring point. It's where plants grow, so it supports that growing plant. Second, it provides the airspace and oxygen to roots. Roots have to have oxygen unless they're specially adapted not to. That's why lots of times you hear, don't allow this plant to get wet feet, don't plant this in a wet area. It's because that pore space that was on that previous slide is actually sort of an either or proposition. Either you have airspace or you have water space. And so if you saturate that space with water, then you don't have air and thus oxygen for those roots, and they actually will die. So the oxygen available to roots in that airspace is important. Of course, water storage is important. We all know what happens when plants don't get water. They wilt and can eventually die. So certainly water storage is important, that we allow the media to do that, but it has to be balanced again with the needs and growing environment of the plant, and nutrient storage. In truth, nutrient storage is not probably a focus a lot of houseplants, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But by and large, it would be unusual to see houseplants suffering nutrient deficiencies or having problems with houseplants, and that be the focus of it. But it is something to keep in mind that is one of the functions that we have with potting media. So what are potting medias? And again, they're not soils technically, but I won't yell at you if you call them that. They're made up of things like peat moss, sometimes composted barks, sand, compost, coconut core, which that's the husk around a coconut, which can be ground up and used. More mineral type ingredients like perlite and vermiculite, which are kind of heat processed minerals. Lime may be added depending on the mix to get the proper pH. Calcined clays is another product that's created by heating clays. And what we need to understand is that the characteristics in that final potting media are influenced by its components. And what I mean by that is a potting mix that has a high percentage of peat moss is going to behave much differently than one that has a significant amount of sand as a component. For instance, the peat moss has the ability to hold much more water. Sand is much less likely to hold water. Same thing with nutrients. Peat moss will do a better job retaining nutrients where sand quickly loses nutrients. So we can change our management based on those characteristics. So in truth, for the average plant, the average potting mix or media is going to be sufficient. But certainly you can find recipes for potting medias and mix up your own. Quite honestly, generally, you're probably going to spend more money than if you buy a quality one to begin with. I do want to have this one proviso added in here, and this is taken from a publication which you'll actually receive by email. What you'll be receiving is an email that has a link to a survey to help us understand how to better do these presentations and ask you a few questions. But also it's going to have a PDF that has a number of resources that we used in building the presentations this evening. So you'll have access to that, and you'll have the full publication, but I basically kind of took out a paragraph and then chopped it up a little bit to make it all fit on one slide. And so a lot of people, and you can still find this recommended in books, sometimes in magazines or newspapers, they'll talk about adding things like gravel to the bottom of a pot, specifically to aid in the drainage of water from the pot. So here's the quote. Nearly 100 years ago, soil scientists demonstrated that water does not move easily from layers of finer textured materials, which in the case of a houseplant would be the potting media, to layers of more coarse texture, which in the example would be gravel. And the reason is it has to do with what influences movement of water in soils. So it's adhesion, cohesion, and gravity. We're not going to go into any more depth than that at the moment because I don't think it's necessary. But the rest of the statement continues. Additionally, one study found that more moisture was retained, so the soil stayed wetter, in the soil underlain by gravel than underlain by sand. Therefore, the coarser the underlying material, the more difficult it is for water to move across the interface. So basically what she's summarizing is when we throw gravel in the bottom of that pot, we're doing exactly the opposite of what most people think they're doing. They're actually making the soil stay wetter, not allowing it to be more free draining. This is also the same reason why you may hear it recommended, do not amend the soil of a tree that we're planting. So if we dig out a hole for the tree, a lot of people want to throw in a bunch of compost or things like that. You don't want to do that because when you start changing pore size, those textures, you start influencing water movement. So you can basically create a tree that's planted in a hole that's waterlogged just by adding in all those amendments. And so it's the same principle carried over to another situation. So let me encourage you, do not add gravel to a pot to aid in drainage. I suggest always start with buying a quality potting media. And of course, that begs the question, well, what does that mean? Basically, don't buy the cheapest and don't buy the most expensive. Typically, the cheapest product is cheapest because it has a lack of quality. Either it's not produced to the highest standard, maybe that doesn't have exactly what's needed, but typically the cheapest isn't the best. At the same time, most often the most expensive is most expensive for a reason other than its quality. Sometimes it's a name or maybe it's a gimmick to it. So I always say shoot for the middle. Most mid-price potting medias are probably going to be sufficient for the average house plant. Personally, I don't worry about features like hydrogels. Those are those water-absorbing crystals. There's nothing wrong with them, but again, to me, it's a way to increase the cost of the product. And honestly, we still need to do a good job with watering, even if they're there. That may give us a little bit of a buffer, but I certainly don't think that it's an absolute requirement they be included. In a similar sense, the extended release fertilizers that you see in many of these potting medias, you'll often see commented on the bag things like, feeds for up to 6 months or things like that. They have fertilizers contained in them, and it's neither good nor bad. Certainly fertilizers are good to have, but if they're absent, we can add them ourselves as we go along with like water-soluble fertilizers. We do need to know if they're there or not because we don't want to over-fertilize our plants. But again, a quality product doesn't necessarily have to have an extended release fertilizer in there. I will say that depending on the plant, for instance, like with orchids or cactus and succulents or citrus, you will find some medias that are specially advertised for them. Those are actually useful because those are all medias that do have special characteristics. For instance, basically orchids are a bark mixture, so we certainly wouldn't want to plant orchids in a peat moss mixture. It'd be terrible, they'd die. And certainly things like cactus and succulents and even citrus want a very free draining soil. So typically we'll find that those have a large component of sand. So there are differences with some specialized medias, and sometimes those are justified, but in truth, we can take a standard potting media. And for instance, if we want to make it more free draining, we can add perlite, for instance, or coarse sand to it, and that will help us aid in drainage. And again, we're not creating a layer in the bottom of the pot, we're actually mixing it throughout that media. And so by doing that, we can adjust in very basic potting mix for our needs just by including some amendments in that way. But again, specialized media are useful and can be valuable to us. We can prune houseplants. There's certainly nothing wrong with trimming plants for aesthetics or if it's starting to overgrow the space that we have it in. And certainly sometimes we want to do it because maybe we have an insect infestation on part of it. So removing that, or maybe we have a disease coming in on it. Certainly we can prune for health. Nothing wrong with that. Potting plants, it is something that's important. We have a picture there of a very root-bound plant. That certainly is not ideal. The plant may be surviving, but certainly not a goal we're shooting for. So we do want to pot our plants up incrementally over time, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. There are some plants that actually perform quite well when they're root-bound and maybe even do certain things better. For instance, spider plants, when you transfer spider plants to a new pot, if they haven't started producing the offset plants, the little spiders that come out on runners, it probably won't for a little while until its roots start to fill that pot. So generally we see more of those offsets produce as plants have filled the pot. Certainly we wouldn't want it quite as root bound as the picture there, and that's not a spider plant, but some plants do actually have no problem being root bound. Sansevieria, which are snake plants, and there's several different species of those, is another one that tolerates being crowded in a pot quite well. We are talking about plants that oftentimes we may be keeping for several years, and we may not be moving them up in size quickly because they aren't growing fast, especially when we have indoor conditions that are on the lower end of acceptable light and things like that. You'll note that your plants aren't growing fast. And that's not a problem, but what it does sometimes mean is the level of potting media will start to subside or drop in the pot. You can actually top that off. We would want to do it gradually. You wouldn't want to put 6 inches over the top of a pot if it had to drop that much, but definitely, yearly, just topping that off just a little bit is certainly a good aspect to consider. Of course, you can also look at potting up at the same time too. When we're talking about moving plants to a larger size, there are some things we want to be careful with, and that's getting too big too fast. So the difficulty with that is when we have too large of a pot, the plant basically stays too wet. If it's too small, then we have less growth than we might want. But in those scenarios, certainly, again, consider the plant at hand. For instance, I have potted up this year a strawberry mint plant. I live in an apartment, so I don't have a big garden, so I actually have it in a pot. And I went from a 2-inch, 3-inch container up to about an 8-inch pot, which is much larger than you'd ever want to do. But while it's been growing in, I've been very careful with watering it. I don't soak it down. Because of that, I didn't let it get too wet. So certainly when you have vigorous growers, you can kind of move up faster than you might. You still want to take in consideration that you're not waterlogging that plant. So the general rule of thumb we operate on is we typically don't want to exceed the prior container size by more than 2 inches in diameter. And just a reminder, diameter is just a distance across that pot. Doesn't matter if it's circle or a square. Again, incrementally taking plants up is better because it allows them not to become waterlogged. The type of pot we choose does have some influence on that growing environment. So the quickest drying pots that we have access to are unglazed terracotta. So this is great for things like succulents and other plants that have developed in dry conditions that don't want to stay wet. Literally, the terracotta helps wick moisture away, so they dry out the fastest. So we certainly wouldn't want to put a plant that needs wet conditions in an unglazed terracotta pot because it's going to dry out faster, which suddenly means we have to be watering more frequently. Wooden containers, and of course you might think, well, who uses wooden pots? Well, coming from Kentucky, whiskey barrel planters are something that you can see quite often. And so wooden containers are sort of a medium drying. They're not as fast as terracotta, but they don't hold water as long as plastic pots or glazed ceramics. So if you are using wooden containers, take that in consideration. Again, depending what plant you're putting in there, you may want to be thrifty with the water, or you may want to be more frequent. And of course, as I just mentioned, plastic pots and glazed ceramic are the slowest drying. So they're particularly good if you have plants that have needs to or desires to stay wetter for longer periods. But again, you can still put those that need drier conditions. Just make sure you have a good free draining potting media in there and water them accordingly and maybe reduce the frequency otherwise than you might. Wilting happens even with things that are very drought tolerant and heat tolerant. So you can see kind of some of these leaves of a jade tree are starting to show some wrinkling. That wrinkling is in fact wilting sort of for this plant. It's not going to be as dramatic as some plants. So even those plants that are highly drought tolerant will need watering even in winter, although at a reduced rate. I will say, and I've grown jade several times before and have one currently, before things get really, really, really bad, it'll actually start dropping leaves off. Ask me how I know that, because sometimes I forget to water it. Certainly they are a tough plant, and we'll actually talk about them a little more this evening because they are one of those tough 10. But even those tough plants do need water, and we do need to pay attention to what our plants are telling us. This may be a little more dramatic and a little bit easier to see. This was actually, I found it online. It was a perfect example. It was a peace lily. And if you've grown a peace lily, you've probably seen one that looks like the one on the left where, it should have been watered. The great thing about something like a peace lily is that it can actually bounce back quite well. Last week, I had virtually the same situation with a polka dot plant, if you're familiar with that. I had missed watering it for at least 1 week, maybe even 2, and it was just flat down, and I actually thought I'd lost it, but I went ahead and watered it, and it bounced right back. It lost a few lower leaves, but it's doing fine now. The bad thing was it was my wife's plant, so I certainly was happy that it came back from that. But definitely pay attention to our plants, but don't necessarily just toss them just because we find them in a wilted condition. Give them a chance to regrow, to recover. It doesn't mean there's not going to be an impact. So especially on something like peace lilies, we may see some browning of some of the leaves, some tip dieback. When we see those sort of things on plants, sometimes that can be an indication that maybe we're going a little bit too long between watering. So definitely it is something to look at. A rule of thumb for most of the plants, and definitely the plants we're looking at tonight, you at least want the top ½ inch of soil to dry out. So that's not very deep. So if we see a dry surface on the plant, chances are we have met that ½ inch. The average plant, we don't want to go super dry. Some of our succulent type plants and those that are adapted to those desert conditions, we can allow to dry further. I will caution that we don't want plants to stand in water. So if we are using any sort of catch pan or saucer or different things like that to catch the water that flows out of the pot, it's a good idea to put pebbles into that basin or that saucer so that the pot actually stands out of the water. Now keep in mind, I'm saying put the pebbles underneath the flower pot, not in the flower pot, because what it does, it physically elevates that pot out of the water. If we allow a plant to sit in water like that, in standing water, the very bottommost part of that container is going to become waterlogged and stay waterlogged. And that means we're not going to have roots growing in there. And if we do have roots there, we're liable to rot them. So we don't want plants to stand in water any length of time. Sometimes, and there are some containers that allow you to water from the bottom, certainly that's acceptable, but you're going to limit the amount of time that that plant is standing in that water. You're not going to keep it in there indefinitely. So if you're watering by that way, I would say allow it to sit there for 30 minutes and then probably pull it. You'll probably find that it has absorbed all the water it's going to after that point. Fertilizing. I do not believe that fertilizing houseplants should be our priority. Again, it would be highly unusual to see houseplants displaying some sort of nutritional deficiency. And in fact, when we start adding fertilizer, we can be pushing that plant to grow whether it wants to or not. And that's highly stressful. So it's going to make it more susceptible to environmental stresses. It's going to make it more susceptible to insect and diseases. So we are not going to be pushing these plants to grow quickly. If we do use fertilizers, typically a spring application through the fall, small amounts over a period of time. Oftentimes we're using those water soluble nutrients. So we're adding it to the water whenever we're watering. We might need to flush our plants. So what is flushing the plant? So if you're seeing white crystals on the surface of your containers on the soil, you probably have a lot of dissolved minerals and salts present. Those can be damaging to plants. And the way that we flush them is to water them well like we normally would, and then basically pour an equal volume of water through them to the volume of the pot. And what that does is it allows those soluble salts and minerals to be flushed out with the drain water. Of course, in this point, it's critical that you don't allow that pot to sit in that water because it will just absorb those salts back in. And it's important because when we do have high levels of salts, we can actually see some tip and edge burns of leaves with some plants. So definitely take in consideration if we're seeing that salty appearance on the top of the soil, we probably need to flush those plants. It's something that we can do routinely. If you see it happening often or frequently, then maybe we want to cut back on the amount of fertilizer we're using. Because again, I don't think that fertility is a huge problem for most houseplants. In fact, some may be better off if they aren't fertilized heavily. The good thing is that our indoor environment creates a situation that is acceptable to many houseplants. That basic temperature where really most houses are probably between 65 and 75 for the vast majority of the year. That's a nice spot to be for a number of plants. Many can tolerate lower, and certainly they can tolerate higher, but that household environment works well. Light is extremely important, and just so you know, and these are in general terms when we're talking about exposure and the quality or quantity of light. So east gives us excellent light. It's earlier in the day, so it doesn't have a lot of heat associated with it. So it's a lot of light, but less water loss than, say, the west and the south. They are hotter, so we see more water loss from plants. Southern exposure is great in winter because of the angle of the sun. Because the angle of the sun changes, we get greater amounts from the south in the winter. So if we have plants that were overwintering inside, southern exposure is really good. It also has a little bit more warmth to it like it does the rest of the time of the year as well. North happens to be the least light and therefore the least influence on temperature. In my apartment, I happen to have only north exposure for my plants. So it is a struggle to have certain plants where I live. In fact, some plants do not do well at all. What I'll also notice, and you may have experienced this yourself, many plants, when you put them in lower light than they would like ideally, one, they can stretch, and that's where the space in between the nodes or the growing points on that plant get longer because they're literally trying to grow towards the light. The other thing that happens is a lot of variegated plants, they either lose or at least it becomes subdued. So the leaves you see in the background there with the pink tinge, that's a peperomia. We'll talk about it later. When it's not getting enough light, you're not going to see that pink edge on that plant. It's going to lose that. So definitely we can sometimes learn, do we have enough light by looking at our plants. Light is a make or break issue for houseplants. And there are many that will tolerate low light, so it doesn't mean we can't do it if we don't have those ideal exposures, or if we happen to have an east-facing window, but there's a big giant tree that shades it. So again, it is very much locally dependent whether or not the east is getting you plenty of sunlight or not. But supplemental light is certainly acceptable, and especially with newer technologies, whether it's fluorescent or LED, the cost of providing supplemental light has decreased compared to decades before. So there's certainly nothing wrong with supplementing light, especially during the off season. House light, if we kind of categorize it, one of the ways we can measure it with a lux meter, it's basically looking at foot candles. And foot candles is kind of an instantaneous measure. It's not a measure of how much sunlight is there over the entire day or things of that nature. But you can see kind of the categories there where low is 25 to 75 foot candles. High would be over 200 foot candles. And typically you see how it is displayed as a range. So certainly on the lower ends of the range, we might see a little less growth than we would at the higher end of the range. But there are certainly variability and plants that can perform in every category. So as we go through the tough 10, and this is kind of the more interesting part of the conversation, we're focusing on foliage plants. Humidity can be a limiting factor for some house plants, but this list, it is not. These plants have been selected primarily because in the average home, they will do well. These also are going to be ones that do not need the most light. These will tolerate lower light. Again, they may not grow the fastest, they may not thrive as well as if they had higher light, but they will tolerate it and they will survive. It is important to note that even if all the other conditions are good, if we're placing them where there's a significant draft, or if we have HVAC vents that are just bearing down on them, that is a negative influence. That does cause them to lose more water. It can cause them to be colder or hotter than they might like. So we do want to consider placing them away from drafts and vents. So if we have them in a bay window or something like that, and maybe it's only a single pane window, especially in winter, those plants are going to be exposed to colder temperatures than we might realize. So take that into consideration. So snake plants. This also has the common name of mother-in-law's tongue. So that might be another name you've heard it by. In the back there, you see a variegated version. Very excellent plant. Does not require a ton of water. These are ones that can very much tolerate drier conditions. We certainly want a surface of their soil to be dry before we re-water. Again, they survive low light. You can see these in the interiors of buildings. They're doing okay. Again, nighttime temperatures, daytime temperatures are relatively easy to achieve. They don't need a lot of humidity. You can see that's really a wide range of relative humidity that makes them happy. I do think using a fast draining mix is important. If you don't, I think you can suffer some root rot issues, especially if you water it a little bit too frequently. Those fast draining mixes or easy draining mixes will actually help compensate if we do water too much because it doesn't allow it to stay around. These are actually easy to propagate. There are leaf cuttings or divisions that happen. They will put off small little plants. I will say that some of the variegated versions may not come true from leaf cuttings, and it's because they're chimera plants, and chimeras do not always come true, so just be aware of that. Another plant that is a very tough plant for us, and the name kind of alludes to that, the cast iron plant. Again, another one that works well at these low and medium lights. This is a plant that we can actually grow out of doors. So it actually survives our natural environment outdoors. So indoors, it's really kind of a breeze for it. It can handle low relative humidity again. It's, again, allow it to dry out, let that surface be dry at rewatering, and propagation by division. The good thing about a lot of house plants is they're easily shared, and sometimes that's one of the things that helps make them attractive to folks, is they are able to share their enjoyment of these plants. Philodendron, there are a number of different species of philodendron. This is one here. The heartleaf vine, some of you may be familiar with, is another type of philodendron. So there is, again, variability in forms and leaf shape out there. A lot of uniqueness is available. Again, easy to grow in the house, doesn't demand a lot of light. Temperature is good, maybe a little bit more relative humidity than some, but again, very easily achieved within the house. Surface dry at rewatering. None of these are going to be plants that we have to worry about keeping wet all the time. And again, not difficult to propagate. Pothos or golden pothos, sometimes called devil's ivy. This can be a lovely plant. This is one that I actually like to put outdoors during the summer. When you do that, you'll see a lot more variegation and you'll see a lot more gold color. I will say that I have seen heavily variegated plants, so plants that are very white sometimes grow very slowly. That actually may be a good thing. If you don't want it to overgrow the pot or the location you have it at, a heavily variegated one may be exactly the variety to get. But again, tolerate low light very well, easily meet the requirements within the home for the environment it thrives in. And again, not picky about moisture, extremely easy to propagate. And this is one that very often you will want to be pruning or giving a haircut because especially typically you'll have 1 or 2 vines on the plant that start growing first, and they will grow rapidly, and so you kind of have an unkempt look. So lots of times people will even those up. The great thing is those prunings make excellent cuttings for propagation. So this is another one that's easy to share, or even stick them back in the pot and just make the plant even look fuller. Monstera. So again, we mentioned this at the beginning. This is kind of the famous one of Instagram. It's a one that it's actually hard to find right now. It's so popular. So this is one of all the 10, this is probably the one you're least likely able to be finding easily. Doesn't mean it's not out there at some of our local nurseries or greenhouses, but it may be a little more difficult than some of the others we mentioned tonight. Again, it's popular because it's easy to grow. It does well. Nothing particularly unusual or hard about it compared to the others. They can get very large. So that maybe is one detracting thing on these, is they may grow larger than you have room for. So keep that in mind. What's interesting there is what you see on your screen, those sort of honeycomb looking things are actually a fruit that is actually edible. So that is something that is unique to this one. Most of the other plants we're not going to be eating. There's one in particular we'll mention that we definitely don't want to try. So Arrowhead Vine, and I know when you look at that picture, you're like, that's not a vine. And in truth, when it's small like this, it doesn't vine. It's more clump forming. But again, easily does well with interior light. It can go up to higher levels. So again, a lot of these plants, they'll tolerate low light conditions, but that doesn't mean we can't put them in higher light situations. And in fact, when we do, we'll see that these plants can take off and grow quickly. Another one that propagates easily from cuttings, and one that once it gets older and starts running, again, a good candidate for pruning. Spider plants. Spider plants are one of my favorites. I think they're just an interesting plant. They're pretty tough. I will say they can benefit from a more even moisture approach than some of these other plants. So they would like to not dry out in between waterings. When you don't do that, you'll get a lot of dead tips on the leaves. My plants have a lot of dead tips on the leaves. I'm okay with that. It's sort of, I get back what I put into it. So they're actually healthy, they're growing, but they're not the most beautiful plants. Spider plant is a perfect example of when you're growing it indoors, you can very often lose the variegation. So you may start with a variegated plant from where you purchase it. If it's indoors, you may lose that. If you increase the amount of light, you'll see that new growth again assumes that variegation. That's basically just a survival method of that plant to maximize photosynthesis by using every bit of light it can by increasing the amount of chlorophyll in the leaf. So again, not a negative thing if it loses its variegation. But if you ever have one given to you and it happens to be green and you put it in a lot of sun, you may suddenly realize you actually have a variegated plant. So that's kind of interesting. I don't believe there can be an easier plant to propagate than spider plant. It produces those little offset plants on runners. They actually form roots on them, and they're very easy. You just stick them in a container and you have a new plant. So definitely one that's fun to use with kids, or one that's extremely easy to share with others. Dumb cane, or Dieffenbachia, if we're talking about the Latin name. The reason it's called dumb cane is not because of intelligence, but because it has calcium oxalate crystals within it that will actually cause numbness. So this would be one that we would definitely never want to consume. Oddly enough, one of those stories I've collected over the years, when I was in college in a plant propagation class at the University of Kentucky, they actually made us wear goggles during one laboratory session when we were propagating houseplants. The reason we had to wear them is the prior year, somebody had managed to squirt this plant sap into their eyes when they were doing cuttings. I don't know how that happens. It's not that liquidy of a plant, but somehow they did that, and they actually had to go to the emergency room. So this does have a sap that can be irritating to some people. So if you're having to prune it, or if you're doing propagation, gloves, maybe a little overkill unless you're dealing with kids or something like that, but definitely make sure you wash your hands very well after you do that. Don't be touching your eyes or your face. So this is one just to be aware of. It can have well, it does have an irritating sap to it, and we want to exercise some caution with it. That being said, it is a good plant. It does very well within the environment, and it can grow well all year long if it's warm enough for it. And again, it's easy to propagate. Just beware of the plant sap. Dracenea, this is sometimes called corn plant, and that bright yellow one is a particular variety there. This is also found in other forms. The one on the right with the red edges is marginata. These are commonly seen indoors in office buildings and things like that. They kind of grow up on a woody type stalk. Very hardy plants, easy to grow. You allow them to dry out in between waterings. Again, not difficult to propagate. They kind of produce offsets on their own that you can cut off and root, and really just a good plant all the way around. Peperomia, or baby rubber plant. We mentioned this before. When it has excellent light, we can get the tricolor variety or variegated variety to look beautiful. It does have a lovely color to it. There are also just green varieties of Peperomia. So there's not only the variegated versions. Again, not a fussy plant, works well in the home environment, and tip cuttings work great for propagation. One of my favorite, and I think it is because my mother always grew jade trees and continues to do so. I think they're a really great plant because it's very easy to have them look tree-like. So while not a true bonsai by any nature, it does kind of give you that tree look indoors. So very interesting, not a picky plant at all. I told you I have a north-facing window that all my plants are in front of. It's actually a sliding glass door, and I have a big rack in front of it full of plants. This one's doing great there. It's grown very well. Again, not picky, will tolerate lower conditions. It does probably need higher conditions than some of the other ones we've mentioned tonight. Indoor temperatures are perfect. Relative humidity, again, not quite as dry as some of the things like snake plant, which come from a truly arid environment in nature, but definitely something that we still let dry out in between watering. This is one sometimes in the winter, I may go weeks without watering it without any ill effects. You can easily root the leaves. You will knock off leaves. You will knock off branches if you move these around. And stem cuttings grow faster and I think give you a more upright plant. I have had people comment on my personal jade tree, how upright the structure is, and I think that's because it started as a tip cutting. We do need to understand that whenever we're taking a plant from wherever we're buying it and bringing it to our house, it's kind of a jarring process. They're going from an environment that typically is warmer with higher humidity and greater light, and we're putting them in the house. So if we can sort of step down gradually, so maybe set it outside in brighter light for a few hours each day, just so slowly it can get better acclimated to our environment. We don't want to be pushing fertilizer on plants at this stage for sure. Again, fertilizer is one of the responses that plants can have is to be forced to grow. We don't want to do that. It's going to stress a plant when it's already going through a stressful process. So again, pay attention to water. It may need more or less water during this time period because it may be growing less. So just listen to the plant, look at the soil, make sure we don't overwater it and give it a chance to acclimate. And again, the ones we've mentioned tonight, they're pretty tough plants. They're not going to be that finicky, but even with them, a little bit of care is good. So these are actually some of my own house plants. There's my jade tree. In the middle, you'll see one mother-in-law's tongue and a spider plant. You may notice the spider plant is in the high-end Taco Bell drink container. Certainly, you can think outside of the box when it comes to selecting containers for your plants. I'm part of the generation that was the reduce, reuse, and recycle, so I'm reusing a drink cup in this case. And actually, it really works great if you're doing this for a teaching impact because you can see the roots in there. It's actually got roots growing out the bottom of it. It's thriving. It's doing great. So if you work with kids, or if you have grandkids or kids of your own that you want to just sort of open up the world of plants to them, planting in clear containers sometimes is a great way to do that because they get to see what's going on beneath the soil. That last plant on the right is also a snake plant. So it's Sansevieria cylindrica, or cylindrical leaf snake plant. It's also, I think, called African spear plant. And rather than having a flat leaf, it's completely round. And I actually got mine at all places, IKEA. So it's not that uncommon, but it is newer to the US. It's been in Europe for probably a few decades. It's probably been in the US past 15, 20 years. It's not quite as common. There's other forms of snake plants, for instance, like a bird's nest that's more rosette forming. So rather than having those long strapped leaves that are upright, it's more in a whorl type. And I think that's one of the things I enjoy about houseplants is there are different colors. There are different shapes of the same plant. So you might start out with the very common and ordinary snake plant, but suddenly you can have a variegated version, or maybe you have the cylindrical leaf version, and so on. And in all honesty, most of the time, those different species sometimes, or maybe just varieties, take the same conditions. So if you can excel at a common one, those unusual ones are often just as easy to grow. So with that, I am going to just put my contact information there on your screen for a moment. And we will get ready to switch over to Michaela momentarily. I will say if you have any questions, go ahead and keep putting those in the chat box and we will circle around to them. Michaela has done a great job summarizing your all's questions, and so we'll be able to go through them quickly at the end. If things come up after the classes, please feel free to give me a call. That's actually my cell phone. You're more than welcome to text me pictures. During this COVID period, when we've been asked to reduce our home visits and circulation among public, I'm finding that texting pictures back and forth is doing really well to help answer questions. So we'll get you there, and we can make home visits as necessary. Time is ticking, so I'm going to be quiet now, and we'll get to listen to Michaela.
All right. Thank you, Adam. That was very, very interesting. Again, my name is Michaela Slagle-Saylor. I'm the Washington County Ag and Natural Resources Program Assistant. And I absolutely love flowers, and succulents are one of my favorites. To me, these are the most beautiful, low maintenance plants that can be enjoyed just about anywhere. So why would we choose a succulent? Well, first of all, these are very easy to maintain plants. They're beautiful plants. They come in a variety of different shapes, sizes, and they're just easy to maintain. They don't require much dirt or water, but they do love the sunlight. You can plant these plants in very small containers simply because they do not require much space. And like Adam mentioned in his presentation, these are very durable, hardy plants. Window boxes work well for these because they're able to air out and get lots of sunlight. So what is a succulent? A succulent is basically a plant with leaves that hold their water. So these are plants that have a thicker leaf that hold the water. With that being said, by definition, a cactus falls into this category. And there's an estimated 60 different plant families that contain varieties of succulents. So within those plant families, there's a ton of succulents. All right. So care of a succulent. You need to make sure that these plants have these things, just like Adam was mentioning. They need light, heat, and a well-drained media. You can refer back to Adam's presentation about the media mixes. For these plants, it's better to look for a special potting media or add perlite with coarse sands to improve drainage. For indoor succulents, misting them with a spray bottle 1 or 2 times a week with water is plenty. You need to make sure that you're able to bring these plants in during the winter, because the leaves will burst because of where they hold the water in the cell walls, and the freezing temperatures just cause them to freeze and expand. So, propagations of succulents. Succulents are very easy to propagate. So we can take a plant and basically with that one plant continue making offspring. You can there's a couple different methods, and the link that is on here on your screen has a great article about, if you are interested in propagating succulents, the proper ways to do it. The most successful way that I found is simply just to break those leaves off at the base and cover them lightly in dirt and mist them with water. You can use several different propagation methods though, such as a water bottle, cutting holes in it so that it has that moist, humid environment. And those are just super easy propagation tools. So maybe you didn't know what all different kinds of plants are succulents. But one of the most commonly known succulents is an aloe vera plant. These plants are characterized with their fleshy, gel-filled leaves, and they do have soothing, healing properties. As we've all probably seen here with the summer, you know, during the summer, you typically see aloe vera getting more shout outs than other succulents because it can be used for sunburn. My favorite type of succulent is a hen and chick. I think those are absolutely the cutest succulents you can have. So here's a picture of them. They do well in rock gardens or containers, and because they're so hardy, they can survive in all sorts of conditions, just as they seemingly live forever because they just keep on continuing to grow and continuing to reproduce. Another succulent that I think is absolutely beautiful is the string of pearls. It is a succulent species that has little balls that are fluidy filled, and they have really thin stems. This kind of succulent is from a certain family that makes it more closely related to daisies than cactuses, which I just think is interesting. But I think that they are just really pretty plants. So with your succulents, you can create a variety of art. All these plants that are shown on the screen are actually at my aunt's house, and she just has a ton of different succulents that she grows. And I just thought I would share with you guys how cute some of the containers she has made are. Here's the resources that I used. If you're interested in more information about succulents, you're welcome to email me. My email will be brought back up on the screen, or you're welcome to check these out. These guys have lots of really great information. So thank you guys for being with us this evening, and I'm going to turn it back over to Adam.